In 1916, one man crossed a line no human being had ever crossed before. His personal fortune passed $1 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that fortune is worth more than $400 billion today. Larger than the GDP of most countries on Earth. Larger than the combined net worth of several of the richest men alive right now, in a world with 8 times the population and infinitely more ways to get rich. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the terrifying part of his story was never the number itself. It was how quietly it happened. There was no lottery ticket, no lucky invention, no single dramatic headline. Rockefeller did not become the richest man in modern history by outworking everyone else. He built it through something far stranger, a monopoly so total, so mathematically ruthless, that the United States government eventually tried to tear it apart by law and failed to stop it. This is not a story about oil. Oil was only the vehicle. This is a story about how one company came to control an entire nation's access to light, how a government's attempt to destroy that company by force accidentally made its owner richer, and how the underlying formula behind it all still operates today, unnoticed in plain sight. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a monopoly this large was built, and why breaking it apart didn't work. To understand why nobody had ever reached this level of wealth before 1916, you need to understand how wealth worked in the century before him. And it worked almost nothing like it does today. Before the industrial age, the richest men on earth were landowners, monarchs, and merchants. Their fortunes were tied to physical, finite things: land, gold, ships, crops. Wealth grew slowly because the economy itself grew slowly. A farm produced roughly the same yield year after year. A fleet of ships could only carry so much cargo. There was no mechanism for wealth to multiply exponentially, because production itself was limited by human labor, weather, and geography. Even history's wealthiest dynasties, the Medici in Renaissance Italy, the Rothschilds in 19th century Europe, built their fortunes through banking, trade, and political influence. Not by owning an entire industry outright. Their wealth was real, but it moved at the pace of an agrarian, semi-industrial world. Then, in the second half of the 19th century, everything changed at once. Steam power, railroads, telegraphs, mass industrialization. For the first time in human history, a business could scale nationally, even globally, within a matter of years instead of centuries. And a new commodity had just become essential to modern life. Oil. Not oil for cars. Cars barely existed yet. Oil for light. Kerosene, refined from crude, was rapidly replacing whale oil and candles as the way ordinary households lit their homes after dark. Demand was universal, urgent, and growing every single year. History had just handed someone an opportunity that had never existed before. An entire new industry, a booming national infrastructure to distribute it, and no dominant player yet controlling it. A 20-something bookkeeper from Cleveland saw the gap before almost anyone else did. Most people who know Rockefeller's name know exactly one fact about him. He made his fortune in oil. That fact is true, and almost completely misleading. Rockefeller did not get rich because he discovered oil, drilled the most wells, or found the biggest reserves. He barely touched the drilling side of the business at all. And for good reason. Drilling was chaos. Volatile, unpredictable, full of men who struck it rich one year and went bankrupt the next. Rockefeller looked at that chaos and made a decision that changed everything. He would not compete to find oil. He would control what happened to it after it came out of the ground. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil with a handful of partners and a single refinery in Cleveland. Within less than a decade, the company controlled roughly 90% of all oil refining in the United States. Not because Standard Oil was the only refinery in the country, because Rockefeller systematically bought, absorbed, or economically strangled almost every competitor that existed. His primary weapon wasn't aggression, it was arithmetic. In an industry with razor-thin margins, Rockefeller understood that the company able to shave fractions of a cent off its costs, through scale and control would eventually sell below the price its rivals needed just to survive. So Standard Oil bought its own barrel manufacturers, its own pipelines, its own railroad tank cars, its own warehouses. Every layer of the supply chain that used to belong to a separate company, taking a separate profit margin, was absorbed into a single machine. This is called vertical integration. Rockefeller weaponized it more ruthlessly than anyone before him. The result was simple and terrifying. Standard Oil could produce and ship oil, cheaper than anyone else on Earth. That let it undercut every competitor's price, which forced rivals to either sell out or go bankrupt trying to compete. Most chose to sell. It wasn't really a choice at all. By the 1880s, Standard Oil wasn't really a company anymore. It was closer to a private economic government, controlling the price of light for an entire nation. Here is the part almost no one teaches in school, and it's the real reason Rockefeller became history's first billionaire instead of just another wealthy industrialist. Standard Oil didn't just make money. It reinvested nearly all of it, year after year, back into acquiring more infrastructure, more refineries, more distribution. Each acquisition increased profit margins further, which generated more capital, which funded the next round of acquisitions. This is compounding, and compounding does something to numbers that human intuition is genuinely bad at predicting. Imagine a company earning 10% profit annually and reinvesting all of it instead of spending it. In year one, $100 becomes $110. Unremarkable. But by year 20, that same $100 has grown to roughly $670. By year 30, it's over $1,700. The growth isn't linear, it's exponential. And exponential curves stay deceptively flat for a long time before they suddenly explode upward. Standard Oil operated at a scale where this effect wasn't happening to $100. It was happening to millions, then tens of millions, compounding across an entire vertically integrated empire for over 3 decades. Rockefeller didn't need a genius insight every year. He needed one correct structural decision: total reinvestment, total control of costs, repeated relentlessly, and the mathematics did the rest. This is the part that unsettles people once they understand it. The wealthiest people in history were rarely the smartest or the hardest working in any single given year. They were the ones who set up a compounding system early and had the discipline to leave it alone long enough for exponential growth to take over. By the early 1900s, Standard Oil's grip on American oil had become impossible to ignore. Journalists of the era, most famously Ida Tarbell, published detailed investigations exposing how the company had crushed competitors through pricing, tactics, and secret railroad rebates that gave it costs no rival could match. The public reaction was fury. The political reaction was federal action. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it broken apart into 34 separate companies. On paper, this looked like total defeat. The government dismantling, piece by piece, the machine Rockefeller had spent 40 years building. What actually happened next is one of the strangest ironies in the history of American capitalism. Rockefeller retained large ownership stakes in every single one of those 34 spin-off companies, freed from the antitrust pressure and public scrutiny that came from operating as one giant, threatening entity. Several of those companies were suddenly able to grow, innovate, and expand more aggressively on their own. Their combined stock value, within just a few years of the breakup, was significantly higher than Standard Oil's value had been as a single company. In other words, the government's attempt to destroy Rockefeller's fortune ended up making him richer. Some of those 34 companies became the corporate ancestors of Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco, energy giants that, in various merged forms, still dominate global markets more than a century later. By the time Rockefeller passed $1 billion in personal wealth in 1916, The Antitrust breakup was 5 years behind him. It hadn't slowed him down. It had accelerated him. What Rockefeller built wasn't just a company. It was a blueprint. In the century that followed, some of the most famous businessmen in the world would study it, copy it, or rediscover it independently, often without ever saying his name out loud. Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller's contemporary in steel, used almost the identical playbook of vertical integration, owning the iron mines, the ships that transported the ore, the railroads that carried it, the mills that turned it into steel. Nearly a century later, Warren Buffett built Berkshire Hathaway on a mathematically similar principle. His industry, insurance and long-term investing, looked nothing like oil or steel. But Buffett's core insight was that insurance premiums could be collected up front and invested for years before claims were paid out, creating what he called float, a permanent, growing pool of capital to reinvest, compounding year after year in exactly the pattern Rockefeller used decades earlier. Jeff Bezos followed a strikingly similar pattern with Amazon, reinvesting nearly all revenue back into infrastructure instead of paying it out as profit, sacrificing short-term returns to build a compounding machine so dominant that few competitors could ever catch up once it reached scale. None of these men got rich through a single flash of genius. They got rich by identifying a system that could compound relentlessly, then having the discipline to reinvest instead of spend for years or decades, long after it stopped being exciting. The specific industry never mattered nearly as much as the underlying structure, control, reinvestment, and time, applied without interruption, long enough for exponential growth to take over. In 1916, the world looked at John D. Rockefeller and saw an impossible number, the first billionaire in history. But the number was never really the point. It was the visible tip of a system built decades earlier. Quietly, invisibly, one reinvested dollar at a time. Rockefeller died in 1937 at 97 years old, having given away a large share of his fortune to philanthropic causes, still active today in medicine, education, and public health. But the mathematical principle underneath, his empire never actually stopped operating. It simply changed hands and names. Carnegie, then Ford, then Buffett, then Bezos, then whoever builds the next one. The number that changed history in 1916 was never really about oil, or Cleveland, or even about Rockefeller himself. It was proof of concept, proof that a system of ownership, reinvestment, and uninterrupted time could produce a result so large, it needed an entirely new word to describe it. That proof still stands unchanged today, waiting for the next person patient enough to use it.